Welcome to Urban Dharma, a podcast about mindfulness, meditation, Buddhist practice, and all paths of compassion. My name is John, and I will be exploring the intersections of meditation and spiritual philosophies with modern ideas around sexual orientation, racial, and gender identities. I will be having deep dive conversations with practitioners, teachers, writers, and artists on the path of practice and concepts of self and other. Join me on this adventure as we endeavor to expand our consciousness to meet the challenges of the 21st century. All right. Welcome to the Urban Dharma podcast with my co-host Danso. And today, Danso, we have a very special guest that I've been very, very excited to have this conversation with. It's Pamela Yetunde. I pronounced that correctly? I've only read it. Woo woo!
Yeah.
I've only read it, so now I'm saying it, and I got it correct. So with that, I just want to do a quick little bio for the listeners out there on IO. She is the author of Object Relations, Buddhism, and Relationality in Womanist Practical Theology. Danso and I will be discussing the book that she recently released in 2020, Black and Buddhist, What Buddhism Can Teach Us About Race, Resilience, Transformation, and Freedom. Quite the mouthful, but quite the important work in my opinion. And this is something that had the video of my lovely interview come through, Aya would be able to, well, had I gotten my Prince shirt, Aya would have been able to see my Prince shirt out of storage. Aya also led United Theologies of the Theology of Prince project and researched the spirituality in Prince's music. And I, for one, have to say that things have gotten a mite weird since Prince passed away. And I miss him every day. So Io's also had articles in Buddha Dharma, Lion's Roar, Journal of Buddhist and Christian Studies, Religions, and Feminist Theology. And this is the part that I'm going to let you readers know on, that my mother's voice was echoing in my ears saying, "Go ahead, Saf," which was her way of saying, "Go ahead, Sapphire," for any woman that has accomplished these things. And this is really impressive for you listeners. She has a JD, a master's, and a PhD. She earned her Doctor of Theology and Pastoral Counseling degree from Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. She earned her master's in culture and spirituality from Holy Names University in Oakland, California, and her law degree from Indiana University School of Law, Bloomington. So quite impressive. And I heard my mother's voice saying, "Go ahead, Saf." So, which is the highest praise that my mother would ever echo for a fellow Black woman who she respected her accomplishments. And as I respect yours, Io. Okay. So let's get into it a little bit. So when I stumbled across Black and Buddhist, What Buddhism Can Teach Us About Race, Resilience, and Transformation and Freedom, I was just awestruck, because this is a book that I wanted to see 30 years ago in my lonely, in the wilderness journeys as a Black man who was trying to find my way with Eastern studies, having really being inspired by the teachings of the Buddha Dharma. And oh my goodness, I just would have loved to have seen this, because it could have meant that my time in the wilderness would have been far more brief. And so first off, just what was the impetus for getting this book going? How did that come about? How did that start?
Well, first of all, thank you, John and Danso, for inviting me to be on your podcast. I really appreciate it.
The pleasure is all ours.
Thank you. So the idea for Black and Buddhist came after I participated in an event called the Gathering One, which took place in 2018 at Union Theological Seminary. It was a gathering of African descended Buddhist teachers. And there was a panel that was open to the public. We had an exchange. I said something. One of the editors from Shambhala Books approached me about writing a book on liberation, but not liberation from an individual perspective, liberation from a collective perspective.
Oh, okay.
And I said I could do that as an individual, but I think it would be much richer if the collective wrote it. And
Nice.
that's how this book came to be. So the contributors to the book were people who attended the gathering, uh, as well as my co-editor who was not at the gathering but was at the second gathering.
And that was
Cheryl Giles.
Giles.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious. The gathering, first I've heard of it. Is it still going on? Or?
I don't know if there's a plan for another one, but there was one in 2018, one in 2019. Before the one in 2018, there was a gathering of people of color, Dharma leaders, I think 20 years before that. So hopefully there'll be another gathering because the things that have come out of those gatherings have been incredible.
Yes.
The book came out of 2018. Out of 2019 came Valerie Mason John's edited volume, African Wisdom. And as if you've been paying attention, Black Buddhist leaders are just popping up all over the place.
Mm.
Well, and it's really inspiring. At the time when I started, the first retreat that I attended was in 1994 with Jack Kornfield at the Lama Foundation. And Ralph Steele was teaching there. And that was like the first person outside of Jan Willis that I had any idea was a person of color that was, deeply entrenched in the Buddha Dharma. So, and then I started seeing, there would Spirit Rock would have their retreats, but they would fill up so quickly. And so it's obvious that you're hitting at a very pivotal axial point in time for African Americans and their interest, and but people of color in general and their interest in Buddhist teachings.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions that came up for me while reading the book was whether or not there was a place for anger on the path when you're trying to do racial justice work. There were sprinklings here and there in some of the authors, the contributors, where they would touch on these issues of anger and racial hurt and pain and transhistorical trauma. And I was just wondering if you could speak on what role does anger play in the path when it comes to dealing with issues of race and racial justice?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, if we are talking about racial harm, then there's going to be anger, right? And if we're talking about human beings, there's going to be anger. So I think one of the things that Black Buddhists are offering to Buddhism writ large is that we're not denying the anger that we have experienced as a result of being discriminated against or living within a white supremacist culture. The anger is there. What we have to offer people of color as it relates to anger is here's an alternative on how to live with your anger, how to use your anger for your own well being and the well being of the community, how to use anger as a motivating factor, as energy for the use of justice making. So, anger doesn't have to be enacted in destructive ways, right? It can be used in constructive ways when we understand it and also when we embrace the ethic of not harming. They need to go together, anger and compassion, anger and loving kindness, anger and empathy together, not solely anger.
Yeah. anger as that spark that can start to fuel some of the ongoing change that we continue to strive for. One of the things that really stood out as I was reading your portion of Black and Buddhist was something you mentioned about the authority to speak the Dharma, and how early on you encountered some hostility in mostly white sanghas, and kind of questioning your authority, and that's something that resonates with me, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on what gives one the authority to speak the Dharma.
Ooh, tricky one.
That is a good one. Everyone and no one, right? So that's the tricky part. It's like you can derive authority from your own practice. You can derive authority from people's projections. You can derive authority from having earned a certificate or diploma or degree, or having completed a retreat or long-term retreats, right? Being ordained. There are all kinds of ways. Now, the question is whether the authority is a valid authority, right? Something that's earned, whether it's worthy of being respected. Mm-hmm. And so if the question is, what's the true authoritative Buddhist leader? Because there are many training programs, right, that are churning out a lot of people who are teaching. The beauty is that there's no centralized entity that says this person is the real deal. That's the beauty of it. The danger is that there also is not that.
Yeah.
And so the community determines whether this person is authoritative or not. The Sangha determines that.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I feel like Buddhism is at a point that yoga was at maybe 10, 15 years ago in terms of an increase in popularity. And then we saw lots of yoga teachers being trained, and some of the programs, as you say, maybe not steeped in the tradition, or not as rigorous as they should be, and then you started seeing injuries and so on. And as someone who values all of the gifts, I don't want to see it harmed by folks that don't have the authority. Yet, as you experienced, we don't want to see people questioning us simply because of who we are either. So I think it's difficult.
Right. And we can't control any of that. Right. This is where we live. We are going to be questioned, right? We'll be questioned by people who look like us. A Black Buddhist, right? What is that? So we will be questioned. And the question that arises from the question is, how do we deal with it? How do we respond to the things that we can't control? Do we continue to take our seat, right? Do we continue? Do we persist? Do we fight over it? That's a decision that each person has to make for themselves. But I just want to say one thing, Danso. I did say, if I recall correctly, that there are a lot of programs that are churning out a lot of teachers. I didn't mean to say that because they're churning out teachers that these people aren't good teachers. So sure. What is it that the student is looking for, right? Mm-hmm. If they want to go deep into the Dharma and they go to a teacher that is on the level of, let's say, secular mindfulness, then they might be disappointed. But that doesn't mean that person is not a good teacher. Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think that the more these programs start to appear, the more there are going to be questions about that authority. With lineage, it's a bit easier and a bit more overt who has the authority when it passes from lineage holder to lineage holder. But as the certification programs start to arise, all of these types of things, it gets a little bit dicier. And this leads me to a question that I've also been struggling with. And Danso, I think, not to speak for Danso, but I think we've both been having some issues with this. And it's the notion of capitalism and commerce and how it relates to Buddhist practice, Buddhist teaching. What ends up happening is that you want to share these teachings with people, but then there's this very Western, very American sort of capitalist notion of commodification of the teachings that I struggle with, because I was sort of raised dharmically with the notion of dana, but then I also am a householder, and I also would prefer to be a teacher full time. And just that struggle, that tension. So could you speak to the tensions of that and navigating those tensions around capitalism, commerce, commodification, the three C's, I guess, and how they interact with Buddhism and the Buddhist path?
Right. So if
and
I understand,
it's a tough one. That's a tough one.
Well, yeah.
There's a mouthful, right? Just break down capitalism for me real quick, Ayo.
Right. And I'm not going to. I can't. But the tension. I think I can speak to the tension, which is, the Dharma that you speak of, the Dharma that's been handed down, has been handed down with the core value and the paramita of generosity, right, of dana, as well as the narrative of how the first Buddhists lived, and especially the first Buddhist monastics, how they lived through generosity, through begging, through eating whatever they received, by not touching money, by having 2 robes, a bowl, a pair of sandals, living as simply as possible, but being able to depend on the community for support, and also supporting the community through their practice. So they had a different way of understanding human relationships. The salvation of the community was based on the practice of the monastics, right? And so you can imagine if our communities believed that their salvation was based on how well we practice, or the consistency of our practice, or just practicing, they would be interested and invested in our economic well-being. But we live in the United States, as you said. And so the tension is how to live as generously as possible while also having to support ourselves, because the society we live in doesn't deem themselves dependent upon us for their salvation, right? And therefore do not invest in us economically. So I think one of the ways to deal with that tension is to accept that we live in the United States at this time. And if we want to have the basics, clothing, shelter, education, a sense of safety sometimes, if not most of the time, until society changes, we're going to have to do things that the monks didn't have to do in order to survive. And that means have a job, or have a benefactor, or some other means, until such time we build a spiritual community that can support us teaching full time. And so my recommendation is that wherever you are on that journey, that you still take care of yourself, that you're not trying to teach full time to a community that can't support you financially, and work outside of that community full time so that you are supporting yourself, because you're going to burn out doing both, right? And nobody
Wise
wants a burned
words.
out teacher. No one wants a burned out teacher.
No, and there's plenty of them, I think. Plenty of them for sure.
Yes, thank you. I have another topic I hope you can address was the themes that you suggested for starting or exploring a POC Sangha. So if there were teachers or individuals wanted to start a POC Sangha, what advice would you have for them about starting, facilitating, maintaining such a group?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'll just say that know your intentions for wanting to start a POC Sangha. And when by intentions, I'm talking about one's spiritual aspirations. So I know that there are POC Sanghas that form just, so there's a space that excludes white people. The belief is that if white people are not present, then people of color are feel freer, guards are down, less defensiveness, and can get to authentic exchange much more quickly than if white people are not present. And when I think about this, what I'm really thinking about is the power of the white gaze, sort of a distant observer, right? Or at least perceived to be that. And so that gaze can be very powerful and can send a lot of messages about what is appropriate to talk about and what is not. And typically, what is not appropriate to talk about, or what is perceived as not appropriate, would be our suffering.
There he is.
So for those listening, my video finally came on. So now you can see me nodding appreciatively and mindfully and respectfully. But go on, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's okay. Yeah. So to know what is the spiritual motivation for forming this POC Sangha, because that will guide the creation of the community, as well as the agenda, as well as the practice, conversation, and so on. That's very important. POC Sanghas appear in a variety of traditions, right? So I guess one thing people could consider is, will this POC Sangha be open to people from a variety of Buddhist traditions? Will it be open to non-Buddhists? What will be our way of practice? Right? Will we have rituals? If so, what will those rituals be? How will we negotiate what those rituals will be? For me personally, a POC Sangha that is supporting resilience or resiliency for people of color to be out in the world as confident, loving, capable of handling conflict skillfully. If those things are being cultivated in the POC Sangha, that's one that I would recommend everybody participate in, be they Buddhist or not. Because the society that we are in now, though it may seem peaceful at the moment, I think the last several years tells us it's just a moment in time, and people are preparing for their next uprising, if you will, and waiting for their leader to come back so that they have so they'll be validated in their hatred. And so what are we as Buddhist practitioners, people of color, Black people, how are we going to respond to that this time around?
I think that whoever has the answer to that is could pick a few lottery numbers too and probably be okay. But I think that this also sort of dovetails into something that I was also thinking about. Um, there are hints in interpreting certain aspects of the Eightfold Path that could kind of dovetail into respectability politics a little bit, or can be misinterpreted as such. Because you have a lot of rights. You have right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, so on. And I was just wondering how to sort of thread that needle between what the Eightfold Path requires of you as a practitioner, while still having in the back of your mind going, am I starting to sort of play some kind of assimilation game of respectability? How do I want to be perceived? And how there can sometimes be a little bit of a grist there between sort of culture, quote unquote, cultural behaviors and, this notion of what it means to walk the Eightfold
John, I'm going to say that's so juicy. That is so juicy. I hope you're writing about that, or
Path. Oh,
engaging folks on that. That is so juicy.
there is definitely some sort of pivot point with that there's a lot to play with, for sure, as a teacher or as a practitioner.
Right. Well, wow. I'm gonna chew on this for a while. My initial response is that I'm so glad you asked that question. I've never thought about it. Two, I'm thinking about the Noble Eightfold Path as a healing modality, not as a posturing modality, but it can become a posturing modality as a spiritual bypass,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, how do we identify when we are using a healing modality to appear healed?
And as a person who I spent a few years at the Lama Foundation, which was an ecumenical retreat center that had, where Ram Dass wrote "Be Here Now," and we'd have retreats that would come in, all types, it was ecumenical, and you could see some of that spiritual bypassing depending on the retreat. If it was a Buddhist retreat, then everyone was very mindful, eating orioki style, and then you'd hear them right when they're going to their car, just it just all falls apart.
Yeah.
The Sufis
Right.
were, trying to be, penitent and everything else. And then the same thing would happen. The Hindus would come in and, everything was bhakti and loving and everything else. And then they'd be throwing temper tantrums at people. And so there was definitely, everyone knew, and anyone who's been in any Buddhist retreat center for any length of time knows how to act the part of the Eightfold Path.
Right.
And I think that presents a unique place for people of color, because we're already perhaps being in white spaces. So we're just, code switching to that.
Sure. But on that note, I will say, at the gathering 1 and 2, we were dancing. Oh, we danced and we laughed. We had belly laughs. We touched each other. We cried on each other's shoulders. We huddled. Um, these are things that we don't do in traditional Buddhist spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And we enjoyed ourselves as if we were at a family reunion.
So you were at the cookout. You were at the Buddhist cookout.
We were. So I would say in those spaces, we were not trying to be respectable. We were just being ourselves and being loving. But it is the case that when we are in more traditional spaces, there are certain rules, right? Certain rules of engagement, right? Because we are all there for a particular reason, to have some kind of centering or contemplation, or maybe a religious experience and so on, quietude, contemplation. But I think it's also the case that we know that these states of mind for most people are temporary, right? We go in and out of quietude and rage, or you know, meditative absorption and forgetfulness. So that's just the human condition.
Yeah. You know, just to follow up on that, John, the idea that Buddhism can be a bit of a tough sell to Black folks from the standpoint that if just taking a look at the folks who contributed to Black and Buddhist, you know, we tend to be more highly educated. We tend to have something that maybe already set us apart from the Black community, whether it's you know, a lot of the folks from the book were biracial like myself, or you know, something that already gave you a little bit of separation from the Black community, and then that along with education seemed to be where most of the Black Buddhists that I run into fit into that category. So John and I have talked a lot about how do we make it accessible, you know, and how do we bring that Black Buddhist flavor that you were just talking about at the gathering. That's why I followed up right away on the gathering, because we need to bring it back. If 2018 was the last time, we need to bring 2022. Let's bring it back. But any thoughts you have about the accessibility of Buddhism to Black folks in general?
Yeah, right.
That kind of links up with the class piece of capitalism as well.
Oh, you want to bring that back? Okay, yeah, because we didn't really.
That's a particular axe I'm gonna grind.
Well, you know, Black people in the United States can access whatever we want to access. So that's the first thing. That's not an issue. We can access whatever we want to access. It's not that Buddhism is inaccessible. It's about whether we feel or believe that we can be curious about other traditions, given the fear that that has been poured into our consciousness around the nature of God. It goes back to a way of controlling us, right? Controlling us, telling us that that we can't be happy on this planet, that our happiness will come in death. You know, crazy stuff. Crazy, as someone else told me, a plantation theology. That I know people will be offended when they hear that. But if they trace the history, if they're open enough to tracing the history of Christianity as it relates to Black people in the United States, they will know that it was first shared with us as a way of controlling us. And so part of, I think one of the reasons why the Black people who do practice Buddhism in the States today do so is because they weren't afraid of God. If they believed in God, that's the first thing. Whether they believed in God is another matter. But if they did, if we do, there was no fear. And I know for some people from my research, there was really no separation between their understanding of Jesus and the teachings of the Buddha.
Yeah. Yes.
And that to me, if you line it up, take a book from Marcus Borg, for example, just lining up the teachings of Jesus and teachings of the Buddha, and you see that they were brothers, as Thich Nhat Hanh would say, they were brothers.
Living Buddha, living Christ.
Yep.
Yeah.
So now the question is, why would a Christian want to know more than what Jesus taught, right? Many people have said, I learned how to be a Christian through Buddhism. Dean Lawrence Carter at Morehouse, who is the founding dean of the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel, wrote in his book, what is it? Oh, this happens to me sometimes. A Baptist preacher's Buddhist teacher by
Wow.
Lawrence Cart. Fabulous book.
That's one to write down for sure.
Yeah.
Doing that.
You know, Jan Willis's book, Dreaming Me, right? Writing about being Black, Baptist, and Buddhist. A book by well-known theologian who is white, Paul Knitter. And there are many people who've written about the intersections of Christianity and Buddhism. So if Black people who are Christian are struggling with the teachings of Jesus, they don't know how to actually live it out, and they feel free enough to explore, and that God will not punish them for doing so, they can access Buddhist teachings and incorporate those into their Christian teachings for a more abundant life. I believe that, having studied both.
To that, I would have to say amen. I have a family full of pastors and Sunday school teachers. All of us, many African Americans do. And I myself would tell people often that I was such a good Christian, I became Buddhist because the things that I couldn't reconcile, Buddhism, the Buddhist path, and Buddha Dharma could. I think that you highlight something, I think, very crucial here when you talk about fear, because I can think of the line, and anyone who is raised going to church every Sunday and maybe a couple times during the week knows it. It was, I am the way, the truth, and the light, and no man get to the Father but by me, which sounds like, to anyone outside of Christianity, a very egoic statement. And that has been the one single verse in the Bible that has kept people locked in that place of fear. And if you can just get past that, then you can read the Gita, you can read the Dharmapada, you can read the Upanishads, and it just opens. But there is something to Black cultural identity and the Christian church. We have our Martin Luther King picture next to our JFK picture at our grandmother's house or on the fans.
Hopefully that's Barack Obama now, but
hopefully.
Continue, please.
But and so there's a part of Black identity that is the church. Gospel music, which then led to, and the blues, which then led to rock and roll, which then led to, it's so fundamental. And I think that that's the thing that is going to take a bit of heavy lifting for folks to get through, because like Danso and like you've said, getting through that fear piece, and there tends to be people that are more educated or had something that was maybe a little different about them to make that step. But that leads me to the question about some of the somatic practices and shamanic practices that were listed. Particularly, I think it was Lama Rod Owens in the book, and ayahuasca and those kinds of things. And I was wondering, do you see maybe some of those somatic practices, some of those shamanic practices being a gateway for folks to maybe look at some of these different forms of teaching? Because it does seem, just as fundamental culturally as the Black church is dance. And someone would get up and shout and dance to that gospel and do all of that. There seems to be a somatic element culturally that gets passed down. And maybe that might be an entry to some of these practices, particularly mindfulness of the body, mindful walking, mindful running, mindful dancing, that maybe those could be perhaps an entry to folks. Do you think that might be something that might inspire people to see some of these teachings, those somatic pieces?
Right. Over the years, I have learned that there's no limit to how people get inspired to explore something. They, I don't know, they could see a leaf falling from the tree, and it means something to them, right? That it wouldn't mean to anybody else. They could have a dream, and before they know it, they're on a journey that they never expected. So with that, yes, the body, the focus on the body is so critical, especially which is core in Buddhism, which has been denied and negated in Christianity for black people, right? Don't pay attention to your pain. And if you pay attention to your pain in your Black body, then that's because you deserve it. You are supposed to live a life of pain and suffering. So let's separate the spirit from the body, right? That's a big part of some Christian belief systems. So we get separated from our own physical phenomenological experiences. So I think one of the things in Buddhism is that, you know, we pay attention to our bodies, how our bodies are responding to stimuli, external objects, internal objects, and so on, so that we can respond appropriately, not out of a reaction, and with integrity, so that we're aligned, and like, you know, mind, body, spirit, we are aligned, living a life of integrity. When I think about the first time I went to an apostolic church, and, you know, growing up in the United Methodist Church, which is very staid, right? It's like I went to an apostolic church, and boom, someone screamed. Right?
Caught the spirit.
Yeah.
Caught the Holy Spirit. Yeah.
Oh yeah, they ran, and then they fell out, right? And they fell out, and it scared me because I had been conditioned to not say a word in church, to stand when we are told to stand, to kneel when we are told to kneel, go to the altar at the appropriate time. It was very regimented, methodological, right? United Methodist method order. So can someone who is filled with the spirit, who comes from a culture of spirit in that way, connect with the shamanic tradition of Buddhism? I would leave that answer to maybe one of your future guests, Zenju Earthland Manuel, who's got a book coming out.
Send them our way for sure.
Yeah, on I think the title, don't quote me on the title, but in the title, it has Zen, Bones, Shamanism, something like that. Yeah. I'm sorry, listeners, please don't quote me. The book isn't out yet, but it's about the shamanistic roots of Buddhism, which have been denied. So I'm really looking forward to reading her book.
Nice. Well, I know in Vajrayana, which is what sort of my dominant sort of area of study, there definitely is this shamanic piece, you know, with the Mahasiddhas and all of that being in the charnel grounds and, you know, doing all of those things. Nice. Well, we'll have to keep an eye out for that. Did you have a question, Danso?
Yeah, well, I'd like to circle back to
capitalism.
No, we're gonna let you off the hook there for a minute. Although it's hard to.
I know it's hard, right, Danso? I mean, it's like, oh goodness.
No, I want to go back down the POC Sangha road, and when Black folks are together, you mentioned an MLK quote about satisfying the thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness, and then went on to talk about dealing with that, or I wonder if you could speak to techniques or things that you've used to help with that tendency. Once we come together as Black folks, you know, it's it's only natural, but then at some point we want to figure out how to tap into some of the resiliency, some of the space that's there for us. And having led many POC groups, I wonder if you have a little wisdom around that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I haven't led many POC groups, so I just want to set that record straight. But I want to talk about the bitterness, because living in the earliest days of COVID-19, having to live very differently than I'm accustomed to living. The things that I enjoy doing, being outdoors with people, yucking it up, having a cup of tea, watching people come and go, I wasn't able to do. And I began to feel bitter because I said, you know what? We know what we need to do to get ahead of this. And there's a whole group of people led by one person who is undermining the entire effort to rid the world of this pandemic. And I can do nothing about it but sit here, isolated, beginning to feel alienated from the people I love being with. Bitterness was setting in. And it was affecting my mood. Every morning I'd get up angry. I'd go to bed angry. And this was about maybe 6 months or so, several months before George Floyd was tortured and murdered. And I was living in St. Paul, Minnesota at the time. And so I was already angry. And then that happened. And that caused me to really call upon the Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara, Bodhisattva compassion. And when I say that, what I mean for some listeners is like, I don't believe that there is a person or a deity that that is magical out there that causes me to be compassionate. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that there has been a description of a way of being where we commit ourselves to cultivating compassion no matter what. So even though I was angry and with COVID and the ways that we were dealing with it, and then that anger beginning to feel like rage, not acting out on it, but being possessed with it, if you will, I still committed to a compassion practice. And what I learned is that I can be angry and rageful and compassionate simultaneously. I could do all of those things if I bring my practices to bear. Mm-hmm. So that's my recommendation for dealing with the things that we have to deal with as Black people. If we don't want to become so engulfed with rage that we risk hurting ourselves and others, mm-hmm. then it would be very helpful if we were to commit to empathy and compassion. Mm. So I'll tell you the outcome of doing that. The outcome of doing that is I went from the feeling of isolation and a deepening alienation to, a feeling of helplessness. In that feeling of helplessness, there was no shame about it. I realized, though, that I could get help, right? So feeling helpless, I wrote an open letter to BIPOC communities in the Twin Cities. And I said, this is how living in a pandemic and the torture and murder of George Floyd has impacted me. I wonder if you feel the same way. And if you do, let's get together and talk about it. So we did that.
Mm.
And then over 5 months, we started this thing called Buddhist Justice Reporter, the George Floyd trials, because yeah, part of going now, I want to return to a conversation about being Black and Christian, and why Buddhism. What do Black Buddhists represent in the world as it relates to Black people? What are we doing on behalf of the well-being of Black people? If we are not doing anything collectively on behalf of the lives of Black people, they're not going to be interested, right?
Mm.
Mm.
So we're doing this Buddhist Justice Reporter not to attract Black people to Buddhism, but because as Black people who practice Buddhism, we know that Buddhists tend not to talk about justice, tend not to be advocates for justice, have an aversion towards justice, privilege harmony and peace over activism for making things right. And we decided we wanted to correct that. So that's a long answer to bitterness and love. And as Buddhists would know, it's all together. Nirvana and samsara, right? Very thin lines, if a line at all, between all of this phenomena.
That's a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that. And I think hopefully that illustrates the values of Buddhism, of a contemplative practice. You talked about your anger, and then you talked about the practice gave you the space to also bring in compassion, and then what happens from there, once you're able to hold more. But it's that practice piece that really gives us the resilience. You talk a lot about remarkable rational relational resilience, and gives us that space so that we're able to function and then go beyond that and do the good work that you started to do. Thank you so much for sharing that.
I'm gonna thank you so much. I'm gonna take sort of us back a bit, because I think that that's a very present moment experience. I think the traumas that 2020 presented, and how we started to find out some of our fellow citizens were not who we thought they were. And 2020 was like 2020 vision. It was a lot of veils being pulled off and a lot of dust being cleared out of people's eyes. And there was a moment when there was this notion of a reckoning. And when I was reading the book Black and Buddhist, there was a lot of mentioning of transhistorical trauma. And I was going to, and I know that I'm intimate with some elements of that. I know that I have family history of people who were murdered by, racists in terrible ways. I mean, relatives, not ancestors, which seems to put it in a place of distance. But I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit and start to look at, is transhistorical trauma, can that possibly be used as a story to tell ourselves, to keep that storyline going, to kind of keep hitting that pain center and activating it to continue to fuel some anger and rage? I mean, we all have our storylines. And can transhistorical trauma be a storyline that can also be a limiting factor?
Oh, I think so. Because I think everything can be a storyline, right? Would you agree? Everything can be a storyline. But the question is, does a person believe it to be true? That's really what it comes down to. Do they believe it to be true? And if they believe it to be true, why would we want to wrestle that away from them? The question is, if they believe it is true, what are they willing to do to transform it?
Hmm.
So, from my point of view, there is an organization, Deep Time Liberation, that takes African descended folks to the South, if they aren't already in the South, and take them to um, former slave plantations, um, as a way of bearing witness to the fact of slavery, and um, and the legacy that's been left for us to contend with. And each one of us contends with it differently. We embrace it or we don't embrace it. But as you're playing devil's advocate, John, what I'm thinking about is, um, are you asking the question, am I holding up? Is someone, if someone is claiming that they are suffering as the result of transhistorical trauma, are they grasping onto something that they haven't really been impacted by?
Hmm.
And some would argue there's no way a woke Black person can avoid that to some degree, because human beings tend to pass down what we know,
Mhm.
generation to generation. We don't pass down what we don't know. We pass down what we know. So if what we know is lack, if what we know is internalized racism, if what we know is patriarchy, if what we know is poverty, lack of education, so on and so forth, if that's what we know and that's what we pass down, then we have been impacted, whether we know it or not. And even if it hasn't been passed down, let's say I, as your parent, I'm going to reverse all of these things, right? I'm going to show you a different way than what I was shown. There's going to be something in our society that's going to try to maintain uh, us in a certain place, right? That caste
Mindset.
situation,
Mhm.
right? So it's difficult to avoid, but it is possible to reverse,
Mm.
I believe.
I think that's a really optimistic note to
I'm op-
leave this this
I'm an optimist.
conversation.
I tend to be an optimistic person.
Well, I think Buddhism rewires the brain in such a way to allow you to see different possibilities, you know, different
Yeah, that's a good point.
opportunities.
Mhm.
Oh, well, it has been such a blessing. We're at the hour mark. I could talk to you for many more hours. We'll have to have you back on the next time. You're free and we're free. I just loved this so much. I really
Me
did.
too. And you know what I'm thinking? We can have conversation outside of the podcast. I think
Yay!
the three of us could talk about a lot of things over
Well,
tea. So
we can hash it out for sure. We can hash it out. We have some thoughts. We have some feelings and we have some thoughts.
Unrecorded.
Unrecorded, right? Yeah. Oh, that'll be the straight dope right there, right?
so
Oh.
your podcast, Urban Dharma,
Mm-hmm.
I blessings, blessings,
Oh,
blessings
thank you. Thank you so
on
much.
ever. Um,
Th-
Beautiful.
This is a dream that we're having, and all of us, all of you, or anyone that comes on, is helping us to create. Because I think that there is a real need for this space, and you can. I mean, even though we've discussed, BIPOC sanghas, I'm in Colorado. I never pull enough people to even create a BIPOC sangha completely, even in the sangha that I'm in. At least not a significantly large group, and then it gets into making sure everyone has a voice. But in terms of like having an Atlanta where you'd have, a number of Black people, or or Detroit or in LA, BIPOC sanghas in Colorado is a mix of everyone, which is fine, of course. But it's not always going to be as big or as massive as other places. So all of these conversations that I'm getting into is just sparking my inspiration on or off recording.
I
So,
appreciate you. Thank you so much.
and so, ladies and gentlemen, that was Dr. Pamela Ayo Yetunde. Please check out her books. Please do yourself a favor. There was one that I didn't mention, Buddhist Christian Dialogue, U.S. Law and Womanist Theology for Transgender Spiritual Care. Actually, I did mention that one. But that one I think I'm really looking forward to checking out, because in the Sangha that I'm in, we're starting to really try to work with transgender language and inclusivity. And I think it's something that really needs to be addressed in Buddhist Sanghas. I definitely feel that it seems to be somewhat lacking a little bit, in my opinion. But I did mention that book. And of course, Black and Buddhist, What Buddhism Can Teach Us About Race, Resilience, Transformation, and Freedom. And this has been a transformational and freedom releasing conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Until we meet again.
Until we meet again.
Hmm?